You are listening to the frequency they don't want you to find, and looking at the timeline they are desperately trying to scrub from the servers, because what you are witnessing in these first weeks of January 2026 is not just a geopolitical shift, but the controlled demolition of the reality tunnel you have been forced to live in since the end of the Second World War. The so-called rules-based international order was never about rules, and it was certainly never about order. It was a polite fiction designed to keep the global South in debt and the Western populace asleep at the wheel, while the technocratic elite stripped the copper wiring out of the global economy. But now the mask is off and the polite dinner party is over, and we are seeing the raw, bloody face of the resource realism that has been lurking beneath the surface of every G7 summit for the last 30 years. Look at the timing, because there are no coincidences in this game, only synchronized operations, and the synchronization between the Caribbean Basin, the Arctic Circle, and the Arabian Peninsula is the signature of a master plan drafted not in the Situation Room, but in the closed-door boardrooms of the shadow banking cartel and the deep state intelligence apparatus that actually runs the executive branch. Operation Absolute Resolve, the flashy little name they gave to the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro, is the greatest magic trick of the decade, because while CNN and Fox News are dazzling you with footage of elite operators and talking about narco-terrorism indictments, they are manufacturing consent for the largest oil heist in human history. Do you honestly believe the United States military mobilized 150 aircraft and leveraged the entire might of the Southern Command just to arrest a drug dealer? Or is it more likely that the frantic meetings between Chevron executives and State Department ghouls in December 2025 were about securing the Orinoco Belt before the Chinese could finalize their permanent basing agreement? The narrative of the surgical extraction is a psyop designed to make you cheer for the seizure of sovereign assets. But follow the money and you will see that the instant Maduro was zip-tied on the deck of the USS Iwo Jima, the futures markets for heavy crude shifted in a way that only happens when the fix is in. The intelligence community knew about the Chinese base rumors because they planted half of them to justify the escalation, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the threat of a Red Dawn scenario in Venezuela was used to bypass Congress and execute a kinetic regime change that benefits 3 specific defense contractors and 1 major energy conglomerate. And let's talk about the technology, because that is the terrifying part they are glossing over: the total failure of the Venezuelan air defense network, the Russian-made S-300 VMs, and the Chinese radars that were supposed to be impenetrable simply didn't work. And you need to ask yourself why. It wasn't just American jamming brilliance, it was a backroom deal. A kill switch activated by intelligence agencies that have compromised the supply chains of our adversaries years ago, rendering the defensive sovereignty of every nation on earth null and void if they cross the hegemon. This sends a message to Beijing and Tehran that is louder than any bomb, telling them that their hardware is compromised and their airspace is owned by the U.S. Cyber Command whenever we decide to flip the switch. But the Caribbean is just the left hook. The right cross is coming from the north, where the sudden frantic ultimatum to buy Greenland is being painted as a national security necessity, when in reality it is a resource grab for the neodymium and dysprosium required to build the guidance chips for the missiles we just fired. The narrative about the GIUK gap and Russian submarines is a convenient ghost story to terrify the Danish government into compliance, but the real actors here are the mining consortiums who have realized that The Green New Deal is impossible without the mineral wealth locked under the Greenlandic ice sheet. They are weaponizing climate change narratives to justify the annexation of territory, offering independence payments to the Greenlandic locals, which is just a polite word for bribery on a national scale, bypassing Copenhagen to purchase a country piece by piece. This is the death of NATO, the end of the alliance, because when you threaten your own allies with the hard way, you are admitting that the Atlantic Alliance is just a protection racket, where protection is conditional on handing over your natural resources to American processing firms. Meanwhile, the media is totally ignoring the catastrophe in the Middle East because it's too complex for the 30-second soundbite. But the collapse of the Saudi-UAE alliance is the linchpin that is going to destroy your cost of living. The disintegration of the Sunni front in Yemen is not a tribal skirmish. It is the result of a deliberate destabilization policy where intelligence factions are playing both sides, encouraging the UAE to fracture the coalition to create a vacuum that justifies a permanent American naval presence. The so-called normalization of the Red Sea shipping routes is a trap, a deadly illusion being sold to shipping magnates and insurance giants like Lloyd's of London to lure unsuspecting merchant vessels back into a kill zone. They need a disaster. They need a Maersk ship to sink, because a second supply chain shock is the only way to justify the implementation of total digital control over logistics and the introduction of rationing protocols that have been in the planning stages since the COVID lockdowns. The shipping lines are walking into an ambush set by the Houthis, but orchestrated by the negligence of a distracted superpower that is too busy looting South America to patrol the Bab el-Mandeb. And behind all of this kinetic chaos lies the ultimate weapon, the dollar itself, which is being weaponized with a recklessness that signals the end of the fiat system. The seizure of Venezuelan assets, combined with the freezing of Russian reserves, has told the entire world that if you hold dollars, you are funding your own occupation, which is triggering a silent, desperate flight to gold and neutral assets that the mainstream financial press is forbidden from covering accurately. The central banks are buying gold hand over fist while telling you to invest in a stock market that is being artificially propped up by the very same liquidity injections causing the inflation that is eating your paycheck. The supply chain managers know the truth. They are terrified of the geopolitical fragmentation because they see the orders drying up and the borders closing. They know that just in time is dead, and just in case means hoarding, which means shortages for you and record profits for the warehouse owners. The coalition of the willing forming in Europe is the final nail in the coffin of the post-war consensus, a rogue splinter group of NATO acting without the safeguards of the treaty, essentially a private army for the European banking elite to intervene in Ukraine and protect their investments in the reconstruction contracts. We are watching the formation of Fortress Americas, a strategy where the United States abandons the global commons to burn and retreats behind a wall of missiles and stolen oil, leaving Europe and Asia to fight over the scraps of the old order. The intelligence apparatus has decided that global stability is no longer profitable, so they have switched the setting to managed chaos. You are not a citizen of a democracy. You are a localized unit in a resource extraction zone, and the events of January 2026 are just the opening ceremonies for a new era of feudalism, where the only law is force and the only currency is what you can physically hold in your hand, while the puppets in Washington read the scripts written for them in Davos.